Republican or Democratic foreign policy platform, and that what we are seeing is something fundamentally different. At the same time, however, as I'm sure we'll discuss, there have been some striking elements of continuity. For the time being, at least, we've avoided a nuclear winter or another major war. Time will tell us whether that's just good luck. In the meantime, we have the perfect opportunity to step back and objectively examine this administration's foreign policy decisions. Can we detect a clear Trump Doctrine guiding U.S. foreign policy? If so, what is it? If not, why not? What are the administration's different factions when it comes to foreign policy, and how do they differ from each other? With us tonight is a distinguished group of speakers who are uniquely equipped to address these fundamental questions. Each speaker is going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then I'm going to open up to question and answer. So our first speaker tonight is going to be Dr. Iskander Rehman. Dr. Iskander Rehman is a senior fellow here at the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy. He'll be followed by Dr. Emma Ashford, who's a research fellow in Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the CATO Institute in Washington, D.C., and she'll be followed by Dr. Peter Dombrowski, who's a professor of strategy and strategic and operational in the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the Naval War College. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Iskander Rehman.
Okay. So do you mind if we stand? Thanks for that introduction. Thanks again to everyone for coming out on this inhospitable night. I'm excited to be in the company of such thoughtful co-panelists, and I'm looking forward to hearing their own thoughts on this administration's thinking with regard to foreign policy. What I thought I'd do this evening is take you all on a bit of an archaeological field trip and try and dig up some of the darker and perhaps less easily discernible intellectual roots of certain core aspects of this administration's worldview. Now, I think we can all agree that the election of Donald Trump constitutes a turning point in modern American history, and particularly with regard to the conduct of U.S. foreign policy, arguably because the executive branch is ultimately less constrained in foreign policy than it is in domestic affairs. Although U.S. diplomacy has never been insulated from the bitterness of domestic disputes, one can make the case that since the end of World War II, it has nevertheless been undergirded by a bipartisan system of belief. And this system of belief has centered on liberal internationalism, American leadership on issues such as democracy and human rights, and the promotion of free trade. Now, whether the US has always lived up to these goals is a debate for another evening, but there has always been a moral dimension to the language and practice of modern American statecraft, which transcended a narrow cult of the national interest. The current president has vocally repudiated these core principles and has instead articulated a more transactional and values-neutral America-first approach to the management of global affairs. His capture of the political stage has coincided with the rise of far-right movements and the so-called alt-right. Now, the term alt-right is itself very contested, even amongst members of the so-called alt-right, and it can be hard to ascertain what it truly means or whom it represents. I would suggest that it can best be characterized as an umbrella movement that aims to harness the power of social media in order to better unify formerly splintered far-right groups. Now, I'm going to argue two main things here tonight. The first is that many of the Commander-in-Chief's beliefs and instincts are actually a lot less unique than they may at first seem. They stem from what I call a long-standing reactionary tradition in American politics. Now, this is a qualifier, reactionary, that I'm going to use a fair amount and often in opposition to conservative. And for the sake of clarity, I think it's worth providing a brief definition of what a reactionary actually is. And I think one of the best distinctions is provided by a moderate post-war conservative thinker called Peter Verreck, who had to grapple with the fact that his own father was a Nazi sympathizer. And what Verreck focused was on their differing relationship to history and to the past. And he said, I quote, "The conservative conserves discriminately, the reactionary indiscriminately. Though the events of the past are often shameful and bloody, its lessons are indispensable. By tradition, the conservative means all the lessons of the past, but only the ethically acceptable events. The reactionary means all the events. Thereby, he misses all the lessons. Because reactionaries are irrationally attached to what he calls lifeless roots contrived by nostalgia, a prime example of this would be the Southern mythology of the lost cause, for example, they are condemned to anger and frustration. And this brings us to another characteristic of reactionary movements, which is their fevered passion and their irrationalism. As the philosopher Isaiah Berlin once said, a reactionary is someone who subscribes first and foremost to the primacy of the given, not of the intellect, of the free imagination and not logic. I'm sure we've all met folks like that. We may have even have had arguments with them at family gatherings like Thanksgiving. But anyway, I think those two definitions give a good sense of what a reactionary mindset is, someone attached to an artificial, contrived and partial version of the past, and someone who is not driven so much by logic as by emotion and dark passions. The second thing I'm going to argue over the course of the next 10 minutes or so is that there is a clear intellectual linkage between the American far right and certain aspects of the Trump administration's worldview. Not all aspects, mind you, just certain aspects. This may seem controversial, but it really isn't. Both academic research and plain old common sense have shown that there is a clear interplay between domestic ideology and politics and foreign policy, and that the prior assumptions and beliefs of political leaders play an important role in the legitimation and conduct of grand strategy. So I'm going to take a relatively clinical and dispassionate approach to this issue, and my talk is going to be structured in 3 parts. So first of all, I'm going to argue that there are some common characteristics to American right-wing extremism that cut across its varied subcurrents and various epochs in American history, and that all of these tendencies are clearly apparent within the modern American far-right movement and are featured within Donald Trump's own political messaging and platform. I'll then explore how key aspects of this ideology have seeped into the bloodstream of American foreign policy and percolated into the Trump administration's approach to international affairs. And I'll conclude by arguing that while this reactionary school of thought may seem as though it is on the rise, it is not necessarily in sync with the mood of the American people, and its future is also tied to an intense ideological battle being waged within the Republican Party, and one could argue within this administration itself. So, first of all, it's important to note that the American far right has never been a unified political force, bound by a monolithic corpus of beliefs. That said, there are 3 major characteristics of right-wing extremism, and these are nativism, conspiracism or paranoia, and authoritarianism. So the rather ugly cartoon that you're seeing is from a far-right website. Unfortunately, I spent a lot too much time wading through these online cesspools when I was doing research on this issue. It's not an uplifting experience, that I can guarantee you. But I included it because it's a perfect embodiment of these 3 characteristics. So first of all, you have the conspiracism and the paranoia, with America's intelligence agencies being presented as part of the sinister swamp-dwelling deep state monster. We'll be talking a little bit more about this notion of a deep state later. You also have a bit of classic racism and anti-Semitism thrown in there, with the depiction of the Rothschilds as an octopus with the Star of David. And last but not least, you have some authoritarian hero worship, with Donald Trump presented as the providential savior who's going to drain the swamp and save the United States from all these threats. Now, of course, nativism and anti-immigration rhetoric have been a hallmark of American far-right movements since the nation's inception, from the crude anti-Catholic sentiment relayed by groups such as the Know-Nothings in the mid-19th century to the domestic terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan. On this slide, you have a 19th century cartoon showing German and Irish immigrants stealing people's votes. The German is wearing a beer barrel and the Irish a whiskey barrel. So I would think that people would be happy that immigrants brought whiskey and good beer to America, but apparently not. We know, of course, that nativism and ethno tribalism were and continue to be at the heart of Donald Trump's political messaging. Conspiracism is another defining characteristic of extremist movements from the far left to the far right. For example, you can't understand the activism and Second Amendment absolutism of America's growing militia movements without understanding that they have long been tied to conspiracy theories over the alleged existence of a new world order, some kind of clandestine global government that aims to establish rule across the globe. During the Cold War, the John Birch Society, that some of you may remember, saw communist subversion everywhere, to the point when it accused Presidents Eisenhower and President Kennedy of being agents of the Kremlin. And today, of course, with the advent of social media, far-right conspiracy theories have become more powerful and pervasive. Donald Trump, of course, has long been a conspiracy theorist. Not only did he spearhead the so-called birther movement, which contested Barack Obama's citizenship, but he's expressed skepticism regarding climate change, vaccines, which he has connected to autism. He's retweeted a number of well-known far-right conspiracy theorists. He's been interviewed by InfoWars, which he also granted temporary White House press credentials. And really, one must also view this as a theory of power. So there's a law professor, Mark Fenster, who's argued that populist leaders can actually harness the power of conspiracy theories for political purposes, and that their dissemination can help federate their targeted political audience against the imagined other, which is represented as a secretive power bloc. And last but not least, nativist and conspiratorial ideologies naturally intersect with authoritarian leanings as far-right movements structure their existence in opposition to democracy, whose perceived inadequacies have in their mind led to corruption and decline. And it's important to note that these anti-democratic sentiments are often cloaked in anti-system terminology. So in modern far-right writings, there are a lot of references to the existence of some shadowy, nefarious, federal administrative state or deep state which needs to be dismantled or deconstructed, and inevitably or invariably in favor of establishing a more direct and authoritarian form of rule. So we've seen that, first of all, despite the diversity of far-right movements, there are certain unifying impulses in American reactionary thinking, and that these are nativism, conspiracism, and a tendency towards authoritarianism. We've also seen that all these aspects are deeply woven into Donald Trump's political messaging and persona. But how does this domestic political reality affect the US's approach to foreign and defense policy under the Trump administration? There is, of course, a long history of isolationism in American foreign policy. Prior to World War II, one could argue that it was often actually these isolationist proclivities that ended up prevailing over the budding internationalism of presidents such as Theodore Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson. And at first glance, Donald Trump's candidacy might seem like a return to this tradition. But I think it would actually be a mistake to frame his assault on the post-war order as just another swing of the pendulum, and as a grand strategic homecoming after decades of imperial overextension. And this is because his brand of isolationism, along with that of some of his intellectual fellow travelers in the alt-right, is nativist and authoritarian. And in that sense, it differs sharply from earlier forms of American isolationism, which still viewed the young republic, the young American republic, as a democratic role model and as a shining city on the hill. So we've seen these nativist tendencies most clearly in the administration's restrictive attitude towards both legal and illegal immigration, and in its attempt to completely bar entry to the United States to millions of individuals based primarily on their religious affiliation. With regard to international trade, it has been evident via the president's repeated threats to initiate trade wars, most recently, of course, the proposed tariffs on steel and aluminium, and by his immediate withdrawal from the TPP. So unabashed mercantilism, or what some folks in this administration have called economic nationalism, has been accompanied by a more transactional approach to statecraft and by a habit of linking a partner or ally's value to the nature of their trade balance with the United States. And more generally, there has been an effort to downplay the language and history of American exceptionalism, as well as that of human rights and democracy promotion. And in my opinion, one cannot decouple this evolution from the reactionary ideology that propelled Donald Trump to victory. The billionaire's disavowal of the founding principles of the American Republic, so for example, its creedal nature, its basic and civic rather than cultural nationalism, has naturally also morphed into a renunciation of America's international mission. Both are linked. America's unique sense of political community and acceptance of pluralism has historically lent strength to its post-war internationalism. It has also provided the ideological glue to its alliances with like-minded democratic partners and the intellectual foundations to its refusal to let authoritarian powers carve out spheres of influence. We know that since assuming the presidency, Donald Trump has systematically devalued some of the United States' most important alliance relationships, presenting them as little more than drains on US resources. He's demonstrated a reluctance to fully endorse NATO's Article 5. He's done little to conceal his hostility towards the European Union and the United Nations. And he's also expressed a desire to reach some form of grand bargain with Moscow. He's engaged in moral whataboutism when comparing both nations' human rights records, and he's displayed an attitude towards Beijing, which I think can best be described as erratic. Furthermore, one should not assume that this is a less interventionist administration, and this is something that I'm sure Emma and Peter can discuss in greater detail. Studies have actually shown that while nativists may claim to be reluctant to expand US military presence overseas, they are also likely to be the most concerned about foreign intrusions, whether through immigration and investment, and they might also be more prone to lash out against perceived threats to the American homeland. I won't get into too much detail here for time reasons, also because I don't want to steal my co-panelist's thunder, but the 45th president has in fact in many ways sizably augmented American presence in the Middle East. Next, conspiracism and paranoia. How is this reflected in the Trump administration? Well, I think the American far right's elaborate conspiracy theories regarding the US federal government, and particularly its intelligence agencies and multilateral organizations, have to a certain extent been increasingly mainstreamed by the Trumpian wing of the Republican Party. So this has occurred most notably through the spread of the narrative of the so-called deep state that aims to undermine Donald Trump's foreign and domestic policy agendas. This is an expression that I think makes no sense in an American context. It's more frequently employed in reference to countries such as Pakistan and Egypt. We can talk about that more later. But as I mentioned earlier, it's an expression that has long been popular in the online communities of both the alt-right and the militia movements. So the president and his allies have actively promoted this deep state narrative. Former chief strategist Steve Bannon, you can see here, now somewhat in disgrace, argued at the beginning of the administration that the Trump administration was engaged in the deconstruction of the administrative state. And to the extent that personnel is policy, that claim may appear to be grounded in facts. And as you can see from this chart, in January of this year, a record number of Senate confirmable positions in the field of national security still need to be filled. The US State Department is grappling with mammoth proposed cuts to their budget and personnel. One could also argue that conspiracism is at the heart of some of the more poisonous factional disputes that have erupted within the White House over the past year between reactionary advisors and their more moderate counterparts who have been accused by the alt-right of being globalists, intent on sabotaging Donald Trump's nationalist agenda. To the extent that there is some form of transnational ideology guiding the Trump administration's actions, it is traditionalism. So traditionalism is a movement that has been spearheaded by intellectuals or pseudo-intellectuals in Europe and Russia over the past 2 or 3 decades. It's anti-cosmopolitan, anti-secular, illiberal, and it really centers on the notion that the West is in civilizational decline. Traditionalists are convinced that the Judeo-Christian West has been fatally weakened by the forces of postmodernism, by avocado toast-eating millennials, by ethno-cultural pluralism, and that it is locked in an existential struggle with the Muslim world. If you look at websites like Breitbart, Europe is viewed both as a useful foil and as a lost Garden of Eden, which is a crumbling and godless continent beset by hordes of Muslims and refugees that are all living off welfare and breeding like rabbits. As a European, this isn't something that I've really witnessed, whether in London, where I was born, or in the rural area of France, where I grew up, but things weren't quite that dramatic. But anyway, I think it's important because it's through this ideological prism that one should view, for example, Donald Trump's July speech in Poland, a country which itself is in the midst of some democratic backsliding. The West referenced in his speech was defined almost exclusively as a cultural unit, rather than as a like-minded community of nations dedicated to the advancement of democratic values, and it was later described by one sympathizer as an extrapolation of America First to the international level. We also know that Donald Trump and some of his closest advisors have systematically rooted for far-right and anti-EU politicians in Europe, ranging from Nigel Farage to Marine Le Pen, and sometimes in a not very subtle fashion. Traditionalism is also at the root of Vladimir Putin's popularity within US far-right circles, where he is revered, as you can see here in this picture from Pat Buchanan's website, as a symbol of Christian tradition, white nationalism, and martial virility. So I'll briefly wrap up now with a few comments in how in many ways what we are witnessing is a battle for the future of conservative internationalism and for the future of the GOP. Prior to 2016, every far-right presidential candidate from George Wallace to Pat Buchanan had been beaten at the ballot box. And I think that when future historians look at this election, they can point to a variety of factors. So they can point to the legacy of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, to the ripple effects of the 2008 financial crisis, the growing polarization of US politics and media. But I think the main story will be the battle for the soul of the Republican Party in the face of the rise of the reactionary right. And since the emergence of the Tea Party, a fiery populist movement in 2009, I would argue that the GOP's internationalist tradition has been increasingly challenged from within. And now with the victory of Donald Trump, mainstream conservatives find themselves locked in an ideological battle with a newly aroused reactionary wing that hails from an altogether darker tradition. And actually, if you read what many lead thinkers in the school of thought write, they don't actually define themselves as conservative. They readily confess that they are post-conservative or anti-conservative. These are people who do not hesitate to express their willingness to cooperate with far-left activists and thought leaders, either for purely tactical reasons or because for a variety of reasons they actually share some core anti-democratic and liberal belief systems. So here, for example, you have a screenshot of Glenn Greenwald, someone on the far left of the spectrum who has leaked reams of classified information provided by a traitor now residing in Russia, and who is now a regular and celebrated guest of Tucker Carlson on Fox News. You may be familiar with the horseshoe metaphor for the political spectrum, whereby the far left and the far right, or the authoritarian left and the authoritarian right, are actually closer to each other than to their moderate counterparts, including on issues related to foreign policy, and I think that in many ways is what we're witnessing today. Now, some observers might point to the fact that Donald Trump is surrounded by a good number of more moderate aides, the Mattises and McMasters of the world, who can work to dampen his most damaging impulses. As we speak, the Trump White House continues to be riven by factional disputes opposing reactionaries and internationalists. The balance of influence seems to shift on an almost weekly, if not daily basis. Public opinion polling also appears to suggest that by and large the American populace remains profoundly committed to internationalism and to living within an open democratic society, although when it comes to these polls one also has to be a little bit careful because they can vary quite starkly from year to year or even from month to month. For example, some polls have also indicated that more and more Americans across the political spectrum are skeptical of global economic engagement. But anyway, in my opinion, it's really around these issues that the future of the Republican Party's foreign policy will be decided. And I think that internationalist conservatives are really going to have their work cut out for them. As one historical overview of Republican foreign policy has noted, presidents have acted as focal points for their party, and Republican presidents have been given remarkable leeway to redefine not only conservative foreign policies, but what it means to be a conservative in the United States. What happens, though, when the Republican president is not an actual conservative? So the answer to that question, I think, will prove critical, not only for the GOP, but also for the United States. I note in conclusion that the list of invitees to this year's CPAC, which included Marion Maréchal Le Pen, a leading far-right figure in France, doesn't give me much cause for optimism. But on that somewhat somber note, I think I'll stop there, and I look forward to your comments and questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Iskander. So, Dr. Emma Ashford, hopefully you'll have something more spiriting.
Yeah, I hope you're not expecting me to be optimistic here. I will not promise that. But I'm going to try and come at this from a slightly different angle than Iskander did. And I think, so the question that this session is posed around is there a Trump doctrine in foreign policy? And I think the answer is probably both yes and no. There is now, 1 year into this administration, a much clearer picture of what the Trump administration intends to do in foreign policy, how they are acting, what they intend to do in the future, how they're going to move forward. But what's not so clear, I think, is that that doctrine or that idea constitutes an actual hard break with past elements of US policy. And in fact, I think underlying continuity with a lot of the policies and promises of past administrations is actually a core part of this administration's foreign policy. That is not necessarily a good thing. The Trump Doctrine, such as it is in many ways the exaggeration and continuation of some of the worst parts of US foreign policy over the last 25 years. So in order to discuss this properly, I'm going to frame it in a slightly different way. And I'm going to basically say, well, how can we judge Trump's foreign policy? Not necessarily as good or bad, because I think that just gets us into a political discussion. But what can we use to actually judge how the Trump administration is pursuing its foreign policy? And I think there's three areas that really bear looking at. The first is personnel. Who is Donald Trump choosing to help him figure out foreign policy and pursue his foreign policy? The second is documents. At this point in the administration, we actually do have some strategy documents. We can look at those and see what the administration is doing. And then the third that I'll touch upon briefly is reality. To what extent does the Trump administration's actions line up with either the views of the personnel he's brought in or with the strategies that they're expounding in these documents? And I will say that of those three areas, they don't line up perfectly, but each offers some suggestion that there is this consistency in foreign policy between the Trump administration and the Obama administration, between the Trump administration, if you go back to the George W. Bush administration. And this is consistency in defense and foreign policy. And I should clarify that I'm specifically talking about defense and foreign policy in a fairly narrow sense. I'm talking about national security issues. The Trump administration has also proposed some fairly radical breaks in areas adjacent to traditional defense and foreign policy issues, in trade, in immigration. And so some of the issues that Iskander was talking about, while they form a part of the Trump administration's approach to the world, they're not quite in the traditional sort of defense and grand strategy sphere. They're much more in the trade and business sphere and the way of looking at things. So let me start with personnel. Because I think immediately after the election of Donald Trump last year, I guess it was 2 years ago now, this was undoubtedly the best way to understand the administration. Trump's campaign statements were largely meaningless. He repeatedly contradicted himself even on core issues. Because he had never held public office, there was no record to analyze. So we could look at Hillary Clinton and we could say, oh, she has a record of making these decisions as a senator. She has talked about these things as a candidate. She was influential in foreign policy in her husband's administration. And all of those things gave us some idea as to how she might conduct foreign policy. Her campaign also put out fairly detailed strategy documents. The Trump administration really did none of that. So personnel and appointments offered us a way early on to try and get a window into where this administration might go in foreign policy. And at that time, I would have divided the personnel that were brought into the administration into four very rough camps, just for ease of understanding them. One group we might call the Jacksonians. Jacksonianism is a strand of US foreign policy thought. I believe it's the strand that you were talking about to some extent that comes out of the right wing of US politics. It's a much more reactionary approach to the world. It doesn't sort of abandon US involvement overseas, so it's not isolationist, but it's much more militaristic and much less concerned with forms of collective security or alliances. And so in the administration, we had some of these Jacksonians. I think Trump himself showed a fairly strong inclination towards that school of thought. We have Stephen Miller, we had Katie McFarland, all of whom expressed some of those ideas. Then we had a second group, and you could call this, I guess, the moderates, or I've heard them referred to as the adults in the room, the grown-ups. People like John Kelly, General Mattis, Rex Tillerson, perhaps, H.R. McMaster, Adina Powell, and these are people who, at least from the outset, were viewed as being sort of much more traditional foreign policy specialists who would try and sort of right the ship with Trump and keep him on a course that wasn't too radical in foreign policy. Then there was a third group, and this group is somewhat strange. People like Steve Bannon, Michael Flynn, back when he was National Security Advisor, Ezra Cohen-Watnick, Sebastian Gorka, were all fairly bellicose in their language on foreign policy, but they were also extremely extreme, for lack of a better word, in their rhetoric on things like Islam and the proper role of sort of taking a very harsh stance on Islam when fighting terrorism. So they took a much more sort of civilizational approach to this. And again, I think aspects of some of what Iskander was talking about plays into this group. These are people who see themselves as engaged in something like a civilizational war, perhaps something like Samuel Huntington suggested in Clash of Civilizations. They think that the US is outnumbered by barbarians on all sides. And so in addition to those three groups, I think we also had some wild cards, most notably Jared and Ivanka. We still frankly don't know what they think on foreign policy, and some other senior advisors, people like Hope Hicks, who again, we don't know what they think, but they're definitely in the room when these decisions are being taken. So if you take those four groups that existed at the start of the administration, they had some pretty big disagreements between them. They disagreed on things like international orientation of the United States. They disagreed on alliance politics, how involved the US should be in NATO, how involved it should be in backing allies in the Middle East. They disagreed on how to best fight terrorism. They all agreed a military approach was good, but they didn't necessarily agree on who we should be working with. And then they also disagreed on some of these peripheral issues outside of national security, that is to say free trade, immigration, and how it impacts national security. But there were also some areas of agreement between the groups. And I think it's particularly interesting to note that even just over the last year, the areas that we have seen a lot of movement in US foreign policy are the areas of agreement that those groups shared. Things like pushing back against Iran in the Middle East, things like escalating the war on terror. So that's a picture, I guess, from the start of the administration, and things have changed. Attrition in the Trump White House has been, frankly, stunning. We have lost, of all the people I named, we've lost maybe half of them. Most recently, just this week, we lost Gary Cohn, who apparently lost the battle on free trade policy and has now been kicked out of the White House. But what this has meant for those four groups is that the most extreme group is almost entirely gone at this point. People like Gorka, people like Steve Bannon, people like Mike Flynn are all gone from the administration. There are still a few holdouts, but not many. So this means that the administration internally now is largely composed of people who either sort of share Trump's worldviews personally, or who share these more traditional foreign policy worldviews. And I think a lot of the fights that we're seeing over foreign policy is the back and forth between those groups. So before I move on to documents, I do want to address one other sort of aspect of this, of the way that this has been framed by a lot of people, and that's the idea of the adults in the room. The idea that competent foreign policy professionals inside the administration might be able to prevent Trump from undermining US foreign policy in general. And I think there's a really strong tendency in DC or among foreign policy specialists to frame sort of any knowledgeable person as a good addition to the Trump administration, just based on that reasoning. I'm as guilty of this as anybody else. But I think there's two problems with that, and I think we should avoid it as a framing for this reason. So the first is that there's really no evidence that Donald Trump can be restrained. If we look at his if we look at his actions on tariffs this week, a unilateral decision taken without even informing his staff. If we look at his withdrawing from the JCPOA against the advice of all his staff, we look at the Muslim ban where the majority of his staff recommended against it. He's shown a pretty clear inclination to just do what he wants when the staff disagrees. But I think the other way, or the other reason we should avoid this framing of adults in the room is we have a tendency to think that those with foreign policy experience are going to be more moderate, and I'm not convinced that is necessarily the case. If we look at, say, the Vice President, we look at his record on foreign policy. When he was in Congress, he actually tried to pass a bill in order to prevent George W. Bush from ever being able to pull troops out of Iraq. So he is quite extreme on foreign policy. If you look at the opinions of Jim Mattis, on many topics, he's right in the mainstream. On Iran, he is extremely hawkish. John Kelly, who many people thought again was a moderate, on immigration issues has turned out to be perhaps more extreme than Trump himself. And if you look at H.R. McMaster, likewise, has taken a very hawkish approach to North Korea that is not in line with most of the foreign policy community. So I think personnel writ large has been maybe a passable lens for understanding the Trump administration's foreign policy. But all it really does is explain why the administration is having the fights that they're having today. So the second way that I think we can try and understand where the administration has been going on foreign policy is to look at the documents that they've produced. So, like I mentioned right at the start, unlike a normal campaign, the Trump administration didn't really produce national security documents. They produced some, but quite frankly, they were so badly written by such inexperienced hands that they didn't really offer any clues as to Trump's foreign policy. Now that we're a year in, we actually have some of these documents. We have a national security strategy, a national defense strategy, a national military strategy, and I think these are a lot more helpful than in understanding the administration. They had to go through an interagency process. They had to make it past many of Trump's nominees, and at least nominally, Trump himself will have signed off on these documents. Now, I'm not saying he's necessarily read the national security strategy in depth, but he at least has been briefed on it, and he has agreed that it would be published under his name and his signature. So I'm going to focus on the national security strategy here just because that's more recent and I think a better reflection of the Trump administration. And I'm just going to start by talking about what it isn't, because I think that's really important too. So it isn't principled realism. That's the phrase that the document uses to describe itself. It says this is a foreign policy of principled realism. There's a lot of language in it about great power conflict, which would normally match with that. But the strategy itself just isn't realist in any actual specific. There's no reality-based assessment of global threats. There's no real resource constraints addressed, no prioritization of missions. So despite using the words principled realism, I don't think it's that. But equally important on the other side, it's also not isolationism. So it is not the critic's worst case scenario for Trump administration. Many critics argued in the run-up to the election or afterwards before Trump was inaugurated that the president would destroy the foundations of the liberal international order, that he would withdraw from all alliances, institutions, that he would sort of make agreements with Russia and China. That probably wasn't as likely as people thought, but it just hasn't come to pass. So that is not what the national security strategy suggests. Instead, I think the most important takeaway from the national security strategy for me is the remarkable level of continuity with past strategies and with the actions of past administrations. Liberal internationalism, as it's been pursued by administrations over the last decade or two, has always had a flavor or an overtone of the things that Trump is doing. We might like to pretend it didn't, but things like the invasion of Iraq, things like throwing our weight around in international institutions, we have been doing that for longer than Trump was around. He's just stating it a lot more bluntly. So the idea of America first that shows up in the documents, not a new idea, just being stated openly at this point. In the same way, the language in the national security strategy that talks about shifting to a strategy of competition with China, with Russia, that's not new. It's more an evolutionary change from past administrations where they said, we'd like to work with China, we will do our best, but we will also hedge our bets. So this is just a slight shift in the language, not a big break. The national security strategy still uses the language of values. It might not explicitly address American exceptionalism, but it does talk about spreading democracy, about supporting liberal democracies around the world, so there's no real break there. It's strongly supportive of US alliances, collective security. The biggest breaks in the national security strategy come in non-defense related fields. They come in things like trade and immigration, which are linked to national security for sure, but are not necessarily a core part of it. Somewhat ironically, actually, I think the new national security strategy bears a pretty strong resemblance to the ideas that actually some of Trump's strongest critics have espoused in the past, those who argue for increasing US commitments around the world, even if it means sacrificing some of the economic aspects of the liberal world order. So I think I'm running out of time, so I will try and make this very quick. But bottom line is that the new national security strategy suggests that the Trump administration's foreign policy is going to be different largely in degree, not in type, from previous administrations. At its core, it has a beefed up version of primacy, the strategy that we've largely followed since the end of the Cold War, increased reliance on military force at the expense of other tools of US foreign policy, increased hostility to China, and a range of ever-expanding US commitments. There's also absolutely no prioritization in the document, so it is basically an open slate saying that we will go everywhere and we will do everything. If this is the Trump Doctrine, it is not particularly new, it is not particularly distinctive. So the final area that I think we can look at the administration in is reality, or what the Trump administration has actually done around the world since it came into office. And I don't really want to talk much about this, since I'm sure that Peter, who just wrote a book on this topic, will probably be addressing this. But I do want to address briefly the critique, the idea that we shouldn't be looking at strategy documents in the Trump administration because Donald Trump himself just contradicts them in his actions. Even in the speech that he gave to announce the national security strategy, he spent a lot more time complaining about how NATO didn't meet its spending commitments than talking about anything in the actual document. But I still think that the national security strategy is a fairly good roadmap to the practical way that the Trump administration has pursued foreign policy. The key areas where Trump has contradicted it are much more about rhetoric than they are about reality. So he can talk about NATO spending all he wants, but his administration is continuing to actually increase troop deployments in Eastern Europe. So his complaints about NATO are rhetoric, not reality. His decision to kill the JCPOA, to dial up pressure on Iran, North Korea, that's all in line with what is actually in this document. And on a lot of topics, it's not so much that he's contradicting this, it's just that he's getting out in front of it and stating it, perhaps by tweeting, in a not particularly diplomatic way, as he's prone to do. So I'm just going to wrap up by saying is that I think we have a much clearer idea at this point what the Trump doctrine, Trump approach to foreign policy is going to look like. And there's perhaps a lot more continuation from previous administrations than we might expect. But to the extent that this is the continuation of some of the worst parts of previous US foreign policy, the hyping of the militarized bellicose side of US foreign policy, the unclear, confused aims that previous administrations have often had, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. So I'll wrap up there, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Emma, and we'll turn it over to Pete Dombrowski.
Hi, if you don't mind, I'm going to stand because I think better on my feet. If this was actually a classroom, I think I would just send you all home because my two fellow panelists have really said everything needs to be said. I'm not sure what I can add that'll be interesting and useful. But it's not a classroom, and I'm getting paid an enormous amount of money to do this talk, so I'll give you your money's worth. So the title of my talk today is U.S. Grand Strategy in the 21st Century, The Art of the Possible. Before I begin this, let me do a little bit of an intro. So I'm a professor of strategy at the Naval War College. If any of you have acknowledged the War College, I'm not part of the teaching faculty, I'm part of the research faculty, which means essentially I work for the Navy and for the national security community about issues of pressing importance, but I very rarely interact with students, which for some professors is really the highlight of a career, but that's another story entirely. I want to thank Iskander and Jennifer and Jim Ludis, who's not here, and Emma. I've been working with the Pell Center off and on for almost 20 years. In fact, I go back to Sister Antone's time. And was her brother, was it Michael? I wasn't sure who was the head of the Pell Center at the time. So that's how long I've been coming over here, and it's good to be back. And I want to thank you all for being brave to come out on a night like this. I figured we'd show up and there'd be 5 people, and to have this kind of turnout is actually amazing. And if there's any Rhode Islanders present, I want to ask you if you have a spare room, because I live up in Cranston. And for those of you that are from Aquidneck Island, you know that the trip all the way almost to Providence is off the island. And so if you have a spare bedroom, I'm a little frightened of that really long trip back home. Okay, now more seriously, I have to do something actually very important. And that's my official disclaimer. I do work for the U.S. government, and at least in some kind of odd theory, President Trump is my commander-in-chief because I do work for the military. So I'm speaking here as an ordinary citizen and as an expert on various parts of U.S. strategy, not in my official capacity. So please don't hold me accountable for, or don't say that I'm speaking on behalf of the War College, the Navy, or the U.S. government. Okay. Oh, one more thing. No PowerPoints. I don't know if you know this, if any of you have been in the military or dealt with the military. Everything is PowerPoints, 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 PowerPoints. It was so bad in the Iraq War that the combatant commander, the guy that ran CENTCOM where the wars were going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, banned PowerPoints because it was taking up so much bandwidth that they were actually finding that it was slowing down communications because PowerPoint takes up an enormous amount of space, especially in those days, so they actually banned them. So I'm taking that very seriously, and I'm not going to do a PowerPoint. Okay, what am I going to talk about? I was trying to think as I listened what I could say that would be different, and I'm going to do two things. So first of all, I'm going to put a little bit of this in a historical context about American grand strategy post-Cold War, post the collapse of the Soviet Union, post the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. And then I'm going to turn back to some of the questions that Emma addressed about whether there's a Trumpian grand strategy or Trump Doctrine emerging and what we can say about that. And I'll try not to cover the same ground she did, but inevitably there's some overlap. So let's just talk a little bit about the post-Cold War. I think there's enough people in here that are old enough to remember when it was the Soviet Union was the big challenge. There was a strategy called Containment, which basically was created by a bunch of very famous government officials and diplomats and scholars that basically said the United States' role after World War II was to hold back the Soviet Union from taking any more territory and making any more allies than it already did in the course of the war. And George Kennan wrote the famous long telegram, and there was a Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs, which outlined sort of a comprehensive way to compete with the Soviet Union that essentially said the Soviet Union would collapse of its own weight if we could only hold the line against it because there was internal contradictions in Soviet society. That initial idea got sort of bastardized by a man named Paul Nitze, who essentially militarized it in something called NSC 68, which Kennan's view was sort of political and military and economic, and that our competition was about ways of life and ways of thinking about the world. And the United States and its allies would win if we could only hold back that this Soviet model wasn't going to survive. And in some ways, actually, Kennan winds up being right. Nitze, and that's probably unfair to him, sort of made this a military competition, not a fully comprehensive competition, but really focused on the national security state and the U.S. military, and that the conflict was about the Soviet army and the U.S. military and so on and so forth. So this, summarizing in one sentence, sort of 40 years of history, this is sort of the grand strategy of the Americans throughout the whole period between, let's say, 1947 and 1950 and 1989, 1992, when the Soviet Union falls apart and the Warsaw Pact collapses. So now it's the post-Cold War. And the question is, what's next? What's the organizing principle for the United States in dealing with the world? And some of the wags talked about the Kennan sweepstakes. Who was going to be the next George Kennan? Who was actually going to come up with a big overarching idea about how the United States would organize itself to cope with the world? And that sweepstakes has pretty much been going on ever since. There really has not, there's a lot of continuity, there's a lot of debates, administrations come and go, doctrines are announced, policies are changed, but really there isn't a single overarching grand strategy that you can say went from, let's say, 1992 to the election of President Trump. Now, a lot of academics like Iskander and I and Emma and I make careers sort of arguing over U.S. grand strategy. And there's a lot of ideal types. So, in American history, there's this isolationist strand that we need to cut ourselves off from the world. And amongst the really muscular kind of aggressive types is primacy. The United States has bestride the world. We have the greatest military, the strongest economy, and therefore we are, first amongst equals amongst nation states, but we are the superpower. And there's a lot of variations between. Iskander mentioned liberal internationalism. I think your dissertation talked about restraint, if I can remember. Is that right?
I work on restraint a lot at CATO. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of grand strategies out there. Okay? So I wrote a book with a guy named Simon Reich, a professor at Rutgers, when we started looking at this post-Cold War period and saying, well, there's a lot of debates, a lot of arguments, and politicians talk and pundits talk, but what did we actually do during this period? Essentially a bottom-up approach to thinking about American strategy as opposed to a top-down. So rather than announcing primacy or announcing isolationism or announcing American first, let's look empirically at what the United States did in this post-Cold War period. And what we found was that there really is no overarching principle. That, in fact, and it's a really complicated story, which I won't bore you with. You could buy the book, but I wouldn't really suggest that unless you're a geek. What we found was that the United States, in the military realm, let's leave aside the economic, the diplomatic, and all that sort of thing, but in the military realm, is really driven by three things. The nature of the threat that's out there. Now, what's threatening American citizens and American sovereignty and American economic interests? Okay. Terrorism, nation states, and you can just go on and be quite specific about it. Conventional war, nuclear war, proliferation of nuclear weapons. So one thing is the nature of the threat. What do the experts like these folks think about the world in terms of the threats that are out there? The second factor that influences what the United States does versus what it says it does is who are the actors involved with this threat? There's a big difference between thinking about China as a rival to the United States for leadership in the international system and thinking about Al-Qaeda, a relatively small group of extreme Islamists, right? There's a difference between thinking about narco-terrorism in South Africa or Central America and driving the flow of drugs across the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico than thinking about the Arctic, where it's about exploiting resources. So, nature of the threat, nature of the actors involved. And then thirdly, what's the conflict itself? Is it conventional war? So during the Soviet Union-US rivalry, the big driver, obviously it's a complicated story, was what if the Soviets come across the Central Front in Europe, right? So we were prepared for big tank battles in Germany and Central Europe, right? That's what we were worried about. Is it nuclear war? Is it the North Koreans saying they might actually use a nuclear weapon against us? Nuclear conflict, right? Is it terrorism or insurgents undermining U.S. allies? So what we did in this, looking at this Cold War period, is look at three things: the nature of the threat, the nature of the actors, the people, the organizations, the states, the players in the international system, and then we looked at what kind of conflict is involved. And what we found, and I'll end this story fairly quickly, is that we found that the United States doesn't have one overarching approach to the world like it did in the Cold War. We actually calibrate our strategies based on circumstance, based on the region involved, the nature of the threat, the competition, and we do sometimes we're primicists, like keeping open the Persian Gulf. Remember this? We're worried about the flow of oil. Some of you are probably old enough to remember the oil crises, right? We worry about whether somebody's going to close the Strait of Hormuz. Americans pretty much take that on themselves, right? U.S. Navy actually is pretty much the sole guarantor of international commerce going through the Straits of Hormuz. It's almost primacist. We have a lot of bases, a lot of naval assets there, and when push comes to shove, our friends and allies will help, but really it's going to be the U.S. Navy. In other areas, we cooperate enormously with our friends and allies, right? The war on terrorism, just to make it very simplistic. Yes, the American special forces kill terrorist leaders and attack, and yes, the U.S. intelligence agencies watch out for bin Laden and so on and so forth. But ultimately, we rely on our friends and allies and partners, and even occasionally some of our adversaries, to combat terrorism. So American post-war grand strategy is a complicated and nuanced story. It's about calibrated strategies rather than single overarching ideas like containment in the Cold War period, okay? That's a very shorthand comic book version of sort of this book I wrote with this guy, Simon Reich. Now, to sell the book, right? Because, you know, academics love to sell 400 books. You think I'm joking, that's quite literally, okay? To sell the book, we decided to write a series of articles to sort of publicize ideas, but also to look at the Trump administration. Because, you know, nobody knew that Trump was going to win, but we would have done this under President Obama. We would have sort of assessed Obama, or not, excuse me, President Obama, Hillary Clinton's, you know, approach to grand strategy in the post-Obama era. Well, as it turns out, we got a blessing. We have President Trump. And how much do I have, 10 minutes, 5 minutes?
Yeah, sure. 10
Yeah.
minutes.
So let's just talk about what happens with Trump. So my baseline is that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, U.S. grand strategy, U.S. external policies to the world, particularly in the military realm, bracketing off some of the other stuff, has been this calibrated, nuanced approach. And then the election season's on. And it turns out that President Trump becomes a viable candidate, to many people's surprise. And so a lot of people, pretty sure Iskander did this, I'm pretty sure Emma did this, start reading everything the guy's written. And we can read through, I mean, President Trump has been a public figure for a very long time. And he said a lot of things to a lot of people in a lot of different audiences. In fact, you can find pretty much a position one way or the other if you just read long enough through his public pronouncements. So that wasn't really helpful. And as Emma pointed out, if you looked at his campaign, it wasn't particularly traditional. So unlike Hillary, who had point papers upon point papers upon point papers and policy positions and Senate testimony and so on and so forth, which are actually pretty consistent, we had a president that didn't have a pedigree that was entirely understandable. And when he took office, again, as Emma's pointed out, you start looking at the personality, trying to figure it out, and you go, my God, there's all these different factions, and how is this all going to play out? So Simon and I wrote a series of articles on Trump's emerging grand strategy. And on one hand, so far, admittedly 14 months in, right? Long way to go. We think there's actually a lot of continuity. The rhetoric, you know, with North Korea is pretty awful, you know, in terms of it's different from most administrations in the last three administrations, right? The sort of the level of rhetoric used against the North Korean regime is fairly extreme and more threatening. It shocked our allies, it shocked our partners, it shocked some people within the government. So on one hand, you think a lot changed. But if you actually look at what's been done in North Korea, sanctions, sending carriers off the coast, a submarine emerges on the shores of South Korea, these things have been done again and again and again over the last 10 to 15 years. Afghanistan. There's still a war going on in Afghanistan. People tend to forget. There still is a war going on in Afghanistan all these years later. And President Trump, Secretary Mattis, they've pretty much doing exactly what the Obama administration does. A few more troops there, some loosened ROEs, translate to English. Rules of engagement for fighting are a little bit different than they were under President Obama, but there's a whole lot of continuity. That's in the military sphere. We don't know what's going to happen with Afghanistan. We don't know what's going to happen with Iran. So Emma mentioned JCPOA, right? The Iran agreement that tried to restrain the Iranian nuclear program. This administration is incredibly hostile, rhetorically, to this agreement negotiated by President Obama. Very, very hostile. However, they haven't abrogated the treaty. They haven't withdrawn. We've talked a lot about it. We've had restrictions. The administration's trying to pass some stuff on to Congress, but we're still pretty much where we were 15 months ago. Now, the devil is in the details. Because there's an old saying about, somebody asked, I think it was either Mao or Chu Enlai, what do you think of the French Revolution? Do you remember what the answer was? Anybody know? What do you think of the Chairman Mao or Premier Chu Enlai? What do you think of the French Revolution? The answer was, it's too soon to tell. Okay? In some ways, it's really far too early to tell what's going to happen with Trump. Our initial analysis after 14 months is in the military realm was there are a lot of continuity. But North Korea could go south, the Iranian could go south, and we could find ourselves in a very different world. I'm not actually betting on it, but it's certainly a possibility. Emma did a good job going through the national security strategy. This is the other thing we can look at. We don't have to just look at what the administration's actually doing in military operations, but we can look at some other dimensions of American strategy. So let's talk for a few seconds about the big strategy documents. And you know, strategy documents keep guys like me employed, right? Because the government writes them, sometimes I help write them, sometimes I provide behind-the-scenes feedback, sometimes I'm in the room sort of discussing these sort of things with public officials. But it keeps us employed because we can interpret them, we can assess them versus the previous administration's documents. We can say, is the administration living up to its strategy? We can say, what would the next administration's strategy look? It's endless grist for the mill. Right? So I would be very skeptical at looking at any strategy documents with anything other than sort of an eye towards sorting out, and that's just another data point, as opposed to the Trump administration has released a national security strategy, the Trump administration has released a national defense strategy, and therefore we know what it's going to do in the coming decades. What I can tell you is about how closely they are linked to previous strategies done by Obama, President Bush, President Clinton, even the first President Bush. And we can also talk about the documents and how they fit, I think Emma put it as, how they fit with reality and how sort of coherent they are, both internally and coherent with what the government's doing. So this is a couple of things I'll say. Let's bracket aside national security strategy. For those of you who don't know this kind of thing, and I'm sorry, it's geek world, national security strategy is essentially, it was mandated by the National Security Act in 1947, and then really came to the forefront after Goldwater Nichols, which was another piece of legislation in 1986. But basically, it's every administration is required by law to issue a national security strategy. It doesn't always happen. There's lots of misses over the years, but basically there's a law that says you have a national security strategy. In fact, it says it has to be released 8 months after the administration takes office. Almost no administration has ever met the deadline, certainly not the Trump administration. But it's a legal document, it's a legally required, congressionally required document, and it's sort of the big picture vision. I think you did a nice job explaining it, I'll kind of leave that aside. But what I'll talk about a little bit more is the national defense strategy. The national defense strategy is really a Pentagon product. It's a DoD product. And it's more closely focused not on the full range of diplomatic and economic instruments available to the government, but it's really focused on the military instrument and the defense instrument. The Trump administration released its national defense strategy, I don't know, 3-4 weeks ago, maybe a month ago. I've lost track of time. It was only 7 pages released to the public, or maybe it was 13. And it was a summary. I've read both the public summary and the classified document. The public summary and the classified document are actually pretty consistent. What does it say? This is a little too early. It is a change because it really focuses much more clearly on a particular kind of threat. Remember I talked about threats being the driver? For the Trump administration, at least in this document terms, the threat is great powers. It's not Al-Qaeda. It's not insurgents. It's not even rogue states, although there's some language about North Korea and Iran. The threat is these great powers. Now, we can talk about this in Q&As, but basically the threat is because these two, Russia and China, at least in theory, and we can talk about that, are the only countries in the world that could possibly rival the United States in all the dimensions of power. And even Russia, it's really nuclear power, and that's basically nuclear weapons, not even power, right? China, at least potentially, is a rival to the United States in the sense it could essentially equal the United States in terms of defense spending, numbers of ships. It could, in theory, build up its nuclear weapons. It certainly has ambitions to play a greater role in the world. And the Trump administration has called out great powers, Russia and China, as the organizing de facto main priority of the national defense strategy. And this has all kinds of big changes. So nuclear weapons, some of you might be interested, right? The Trump administration issued another strategy document, the nuclear posture review. We're starting to think about, not starting, the Trump administration plans to build new types of nuclear weapons for the first time in a generation. Tactical nuclear weapons. This is a very frightening thing if you're interested in nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons to think about fighting actually another nuclear power. This is a big change. We haven't done this in a very long time. The point being, right, here we are 14, 15 months into a new administration. We have a track record of evidence what has been done. My argument there is that much of what has been done is rhetorical. The next piece I have coming out is entitled Beyond the Tweets, right? So you just can't follow the tweets, Twitter is whatever you call it, but you have to actually look at what we're doing, right? And now we have a second sort of big set of data, which is these strategy documents. And the strategy documents are signaling at least one big change, which was a focus on great powers. Now, to wrap it all up, I think it is too long to say. If it was Mao or Xu Enlai, I don't know, but it is too early to say what I think of the Trump administration's grand strategy and strategy. And grand strategy and just general military strategy. I think it's just too soon. I think the signs are a lot on the military dimension and continuity. I think their rhetoric is certainly more focused on great powers. So there's actually a hint that no one messing around in the Middle East. We're going to de-emphasize the Middle East. Those who've been following things, the Middle East has been sort of the center of U.S. conflict for a very long time. This administration is thinking no. It's not all about the Middle East. Okay, here's the problem. Here's where we get into trouble. Because I've talked mostly about the military stuff, right? So let me get off the stage with some of the contradictions. I'm rightfully pointing out the national security strategy, the NSC document, required by legislation. It's a lot of continuity. It sounds, in many ways, like a lot of documents written by the previous administrations. But there's some real contradictions, right? It pays a lot of homage to partners and allies working together. The problem is our relationship with a lot of our friends and allies in the non-military realm is starting to really be shaken. I think Iskander mentioned NATO. Like, well, yeah, we haven't left NATO. We haven't forced them to increase their contribution. But the NATO members are really unhappy with some of the moves undertaken by the United States. And those, the words matter. The tweets matter. The subtlety of what is signaled, I should say, lack of subtlety of what is signaled, is starting to cause difficulties in our alliance relationships. It's starting to cause some of our partners, historical long-term partners, in sort of dealing with the world, to question whether the United States is a reliable ally, whether we're trustworthy, whether we're going to take their interests in account. So the national security strategy says, hey, we're going to do partners and allies, we're going to continue, da, da, da. But the rhetoric and what's going on with the State Department, a whole other story, is very different. And that's a warning sign that there's some inconsistencies between the public declaratory statements made by the government and what's actually going on in how it'll affect U.S. role in the world over the next 3 to 8 years. No, 3 to 7 years. And so it's an open question, but it's something we as citizens should watch. We should look at this carefully. Not just guys like us that are experts, but everybody should be looking because these things matter. The economic side of it, everybody's heard about tariffs. Everybody's heard about maybe withdrawing from NAFTA or renegotiating NAFTA. Some of you may have heard about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Somebody's talking about trade wars, competitive tariffs. Whatever we say in the rhetoric of the documents about partnership and allies and working together to keep the world a safer place, those things are things that partners and allies probably don't do to each other. Or if they do to each other, they're going to bear the consequences, the linkage to a lot of issues, including the That's it.
Thank you
Pete, that was excellent. So I'm not going to ask a question because I realize we're pressed for time, and I want to open this to the audience because I realize this is a very sexy topic, and there's lots of different things that were talked about that I think we can start to pull apart. So who has a question that they'd like to ask? All right, great.
Thank you. What role do you believe that Trump's personal financial interest or his family's financial interest play in motivating his foreign policy doctrine?
No, I think we just all don't want to get into talking about this because it gets political very fast. So let me just point out sort of one area where I think that has mattered and where I think it might matter going forward, and that is the role of Jared Kushner in sort of key foreign policy decisions. So by all accounts, despite having no foreign policy background, no foreign policy experience, Jared Kushner is one of the president's top advisors on foreign policy, national security. He also now has no security clearance. And part of the reason that he doesn't have that anymore is because he was apparently taking into account his family's business interests, talking to foreign banks, talking to foreign financiers about financing his own business interests in exchange for sort of thinking about foreign policy decisions. And we don't know all of the details of this yet, but it seems like that is probably where this is going. And so I would just say that I think in terms of personnel, one of the things to watch over the next few months as this develops is how close does Jared Kushner stay to the center of decision-making on foreign policy inside the administration? If he continues to sort of hold a lot of sway, particularly on issues related to the Middle East, particularly on issues related to the Gulf crisis, I'd be very concerned about that.
And one thing that I might add is that foreign powers are very sensitive to the importance that the Trump family places on their brand, their businesses. So you've seen, for example, a lot of Middle Eastern delegations that will systematically stay at the new Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C., because they know or they sense that that could put them in Donald Trump's good graces, and they're probably right to a certain extent. So it just shows how the sort of the intermingling of very widespread and sometimes somewhat shadowy business interests overseas with diplomacy can make things a little bit more tricky, let's say. The U.S. hasn't really been in this situation before, so I think everyone's monitoring this and trying to see where it might go.
Even though I kind of quailed when you asked that question, I can't leave a question on the table. So I'm going to just spin your question a little bit. And I'm not going to talk about the Trump family business, but I am going to talk about two dimensions of this particular administration that have an impact. One is just the general perspective of the president himself and his family, not in a personal business sense, but, you know, in the campaign, and I think for a lot of citizens, the sense that he was a very successful businessman played a role. He's a billionaire, right? He's been successful. I'm not talking necessarily about the audience, but at least, you know, if you read if you listen to cable TV, you know, there was people that said, hey, you know, this guy's a billionaire, he's unbuyable because he's got all the money he can need. Now, I just want to say one thing about the president's own business. It's a very different kind of business. He's a real estate developer. It's a different world than somebody that's exporting manufactured goods. It's a different world than somebody that's actually a financier or a banker. And it's a very, the business of real estate development, which I think is the Trump family's main business, even, you know, in an odd sort of way, I think is a particular worldview that does shape the administration. I'm not talking about double dealing. I'm not talking about, you know, even nefariousness. I'm just saying it's a particular perspective on the world. The second thing is the people in his cabinet are very wealthy business people, right? Almost every one of them, maybe General Mattis aside. You know, probably the least successful with him is, who's the House in, blah, blah, blah. Carson is a surgeon and a multimillionaire. Betsy DeVos, right? Munchin, these guys are really wealthy guys. That's not a bad thing, but their perspective on the world is different, and their incentive structure for dealing with the world is different. So take the tariff question, right? You know, tariffs will affect all of us in a sad way. It's going to cost us money, right? If we get into a trade war, it's going to raise the price of goods and services that we all buy. But if you're a billionaire, you're not necessarily affected by that. Or you have ways of shielding your business or your business interests from the adverse effects of this, which are not available to ordinary citizens. I don't want to be nefarious. I'm just saying it's the nature of what we've elected and the kind of administration he's put together that change our perspective on the liberal international economic order that's been alluded to. And I'll just leave it at that. I think it's an underexplored dimension of this administration, how it deals with the world, is the nature of the economic interests represent. I mean, Gary Cohn, the guy that just resigned, and this guy's a Wall Street financier. He's a made man in Wall Street. All administrations have these folks. This one seems to have a few more than some of the others.
So I think it'd be wise to take a couple questions this time because we don't have much time left. And I do think this is a very sexy topic. And then we got one in the front, Teresa, too.
Thank you for talking to all of us. But what is the international confidence in Trump and his foreign policy with all of his tweets, contradictions, and everything else, where you really don't know with his actions what he's going to do?
That's a great question.
Thank you. My question is mostly for Dr. Dombrowski. I want to preface this with, I'm your neighbor over at Newark, so I see this from many different facets. But as far as foreign policy goes, what do you think the Trump administration is going to do to mitigate the variance between what we have now I'm sure you're aware that we're critically undermanned in many areas in the military, and as contractors, we're also undermanned. Everybody knows that. It's in the news. What do you think they're going to do to mitigate that? Do you think they're going to increase numbers? Do you think they're going to give incentives or up the required amount of work? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
So two great questions, one on perceptions of partners and allies and one on readiness. You want to do it first?
So first of all, when it comes to the question of perception, this also gives me the opportunity to differ somewhat with my co-panelists on the importance that I accord to presidential rhetoric. I mean, Pete alluded to it at the end, but I think that you really can't sort of look at the policies of this administration and discount what the president himself is saying, or sideline it, or look beyond the tweets. Or the tweets are in essence part of this administration's policy. They shape countries' perceptions of the United States, and they have clear policy impact, and we've seen that occasionally they've actually had an impact on the stock exchange. And I think from speaking to my friends in European governments who have had to deal with this administration, there have been certain methods or strategies employed to sort of mitigate this element of unpredictability. First of all, and this is another area where I also differ somewhat with my co-panelists, it is possible to get a sense of what the Trump worldview has been over the past 20, 30 years, because even though on domestic issues, he's varied a lot in his opinions, whether it's on gun control or abortion, when it comes to foreign policy, he's actually been pretty consistent. And my friend and former colleague Tom Wright at Brookings, who we invited here a few months ago, has done a very good job at showing that. And there are basically sort of three elements of consistency. And one is a sort of residual hostility towards the existing US alliances. Another one is a hostility to free trade. and a sort of mercantilist, zero-sum approach to trade. And another one is a certain admiration for authoritarian leaders. And I'd argue that we've seen all of these things in his foreign policy. So allies have sort of tried to consult Trumpologists, read Trumpology, read past interviews he's made, and they have a pretty good sense of how he himself thinks and what his instincts are. Then, of course, there's the issue of the people around him. And Emma did a great job at sort of laying out a typology. Might argue that you could say that in the end, they're all responding to, they're all reacting or responding to his own instincts. And as Emma said, in the end, he often, he ends up getting what he wants in many cases. But there's also evidence to show that in many cases, advisors have actually pulled him back from, for example, exiting NAFTA, completely wrecking the Iran deal, at least for now. And I'd say that there are sort of three categories of advisor. There are the dampeners and the delayers, who manage to sort of dampen his worst impulses or at least delay actions for a certain amount of time before they get worn down and eventually leave the administration, which is what we're seeing with Gary Cohn and maybe McMaster in a few weeks' time. There are the enablers of his worst impulses. I'm thinking of the Steve Millers or the Bannons of the world. And then there are just the sycophants, the sort of court gestures or the people who, who will just follow him or go on cable news and repeat anything he says. And my concern is that for the time being, there have certainly been striking elements of continuity in this administration's foreign policy. When you look at the national strategy documents that come out, that I actually, being a proponent of muscular American internationalism, have actually found quite strong, especially the national defense strategy. But at the same time, this president clearly doesn't believe in his own strategies. The speeches he's made directly after the release of the NSS were in direct contradiction of those strategies. The National Defense Strategy talks about the revival of great power competition. Donald Trump has shown little interest in great power competition. His primary focus, if he does have a focus when it comes to security issues, seems to me to be counterterrorism more than anything else, and to a certain degree Iran. Yes, what allies can do, to get back to your question, sorry, I've rambled on a little bit, is that what they can try and channel their opinions and advice through folks they believe can dampen or delay bad decisions. And I know that a lot of people have been relying on Mattis and McMaster for this, but then the question is, what happens when those folks leave and your only point of contact is a Steve Miller or a John Bolton, for example? Then I think it's going to become a lot more difficult, and we may be faced with an administration that is much more reflective of Trump's worst instincts, that will remain. So anyway, sorry, I rambled on a bit too long.
Yeah, so at the risk of disagreeing a little, I caution against reading too much into Trump's tweets. I would say that they are important when they are important, and when they're not important, which is to say, sometimes he says something and he follows through on it, but the other 8 times out of 10, he doesn't follow through on what he says. And so in terms of the question of sort of international confidence tweets, I'd say that the opinions...
But that in itself is pretty terrifying. I mean,
oh,
the fact
yeah,
that there's such
absolutely.
unpredictability there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the view particularly in a lot of European capitals, is very much like the one I hold myself, which is, I am terrified he's going to tweet us into a nuclear war. But on the other hand, I don't think that the tweets are necessarily always representative of what his administration is going to do in foreign policy. And the ability to tell the difference is where this becomes really problematic. I will also say on international confidence that I think how other countries are responding to the Trump administration, it really depends on where they sit. Because in Europe, where Trump himself has been sort of relatively hostile in his rhetoric, not just towards NATO, but also towards sort of the European Union, he talks about how great Brexit is, all of these things, the views are fairly negative. If you go to the Gulf, and you talk to the Saudis, the Emiratis, they are absolutely thrilled at the way the Trump administration is going. They downplay the importance of the tweets and the rhetoric because they see that on a practical level, he's doing everything they could possibly want, dialing up troop commitments in Syria and elsewhere, pushing back on Iran. And just as a side note, we haven't technically abrogated the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, but we've already taken steps that probably put us in legal violation, and we're certainly actively undermining the deal. So I'm not quite so sanguine about the survival of that deal as I think my co-panelists are, but I'll stop there.
I'll just take your question. So I mean, just like the previous administration, in the national security side, Secretary Mattis, HR, McMaster, the national security advisor, all the service chiefs, all the civilian service heads of the military services have been very clear, the past administration and this one, that we need to get our budgetary house in order, and that our problems with not passing budgets, the BCA, sequestration, have a negative impact upon the force, the defense establishment, defense industries, and so forth. And I think that's been very clear. A lot of the issues are not the executive branch issues, it's Congress. And the ability of President Trump or Secretary Mattis or President Obama, Secretary Gates and others before them, to influence that is fairly limited. So I think there's a sincere belief on the part of most national security folks within the administration that we need to take care of the problem, not just of top-line spending, but just making sure we have a budget in a timely fashion so we can spend money in a rational manner by standard planning practices, which we haven't been able to do in a very long time. And it has impact on, at least people believe it has an impact on readiness, it has an impact on the cost of the stuff the government buys, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a really strong, consistent executive branch sense that we need to fix this. It's the House and the Senate, and they have their difficulties that is beyond my skills to figure out, so, yeah.
So I'm going to need to stop this right here because we've hit the 8:30 mark, and unless one of you wants to be bunking up with Pete tonight, I think we need to let him get to Cranston. So I want to I ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for a fantastic discussion. And safe travels.